Daniel Carter thought he had hit rock bottom when he lost everything in a high-stakes poker game, but the real nightmare began when he realized the prize he had wagered wasn't money. Emily Carter, his wife of 10 years, had been dealt away like a hand of cards, and as he watched his so-called friends claim their winnings, he knew his mistake could never be undone. What started as a reckless gamble would spiral into a terrifying descent of betrayal, humiliation, and a thirst for revenge that would leave a trail of blood in its wake. Daniel Carter had always been a man who lived for the thrill of taking risks. He built his fortune on calculated gambles in the real estate market, turning failing properties into gold mines. But what had once been a skill had turned into an addiction. The stock market, poker, underground betting rings, he was chasing wins in every way possible. At first, it seemed harmless. He convinced himself that every loss was just a setup for a bigger victory. But with time, the losses became harder to ignore, and the wins were too small to satisfy his hunger. Emily, his wife of 10 years, had been patient. She watched him throw money away on games of chance, hoping he would come to his senses. Their life together had once been perfect, a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood, luxury cars, and expensive vacations. But as Daniel's obsession grew, so did their financial troubles. Credit card bills piled up, their savings shrank, and debt collectors started calling. He assured her that everything would be fine, that his next big win would fix it all. But deep down, she knew he was lying to himself. The turning point came on a Saturday night when Daniel found himself at an underground poker game, surrounded by men he once considered friends. These weren't casual players. They were ruthless, wealthy, and willing to do whatever it took to win. The air was thick with smoke and tension, stacks of cash littering the table as drinks were poured and bets were raised. Daniel was in deep, far deeper than he had ever been before. He had already lost more money than he could afford, but he couldn't walk away. He kept playing, convinced that the next hand would turn everything around. The game stretched into the early hours of the morning, and Daniel's desperation was beginning to show. His hands trembled as he picked up his cards, sweat forming on his brow. The other players could smell his fear. They knew they had him exactly where they wanted. He was on the verge of complete ruin, and they enjoyed watching him squirm. Then came the final hand. Daniel was all in. Everything he had left was on the table. He stared at his cards, his mind racing. He had nothing of real value left to bet. That was when the idea struck him, a reckless thought fueled by desperation and arrogance. He looked up at the men across the table, his heart pounding, and made an offer that left the entire room silent. He put Emily on the table. At first, there were laughs. The men thought he was joking, but Daniel wasn't smiling. He was dead serious. He told them that if he lost, they could have her, and he would step aside. The laughter faded. The men exchanged glances, their amusement turning into curiosity. They had humiliated other gamblers before, but never like this. The cards were dealt. The room held its breath. And just like that, Daniel lost. The moment the final card was revealed, Daniel felt the weight of his reckless decision crash down on him. He had lost. The men at the table sat in stunned silence for a brief moment, absorbing what had just happened. Then slow smirks crept across their faces. They had seen gamblers lose everything before, but never like this. This was something new, something darker, more twisted. They weren't just taking his money. They were taking his pride, his dignity, and the woman he had sworn to protect. Daniel sat frozen, his mind unable to process the reality of what he had done. The men wasted no time collecting their winnings, making it clear that a bet was a bet. They had won, and now they intended to claim their prize. The cold, transactional nature of their voices sent a shiver down his spine. But what could he do? He had set the terms. He had allowed this to happen, and now the consequences were out of his hands. Emily had been at home, waiting for him to return like she had so many nights before. She had long stopped expecting good news. Whenever he walked through the door, he reeked of whiskey, desperation, and regret. But this time he didn't come home alone. The men arrived at the house, their presence an unspoken declaration that Daniel no longer had control. Emily's confusion quickly turned to horror as she realized what was happening. There was no escape from what followed. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the humiliation, the betrayal, the sickening reality that her husband had placed a wager on her as if she were nothing more than a possession. Daniel was forced to watch, his punishment deeper than any financial ruin. He had gambled away the one person who had stood by him, and now he had to bear witness to the consequences. When it was over, Emily didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even look at Daniel. She simply got up, grabbed a bag, and walked out the door without a word. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have screamed. Daniel reached out to stop her, but she pulled away, her touch no longer his to claim. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt powerless. Not in the way he had felt after losing money, not in the way he had felt after a bad investment. This was different. This was the kind of loss that hollowed a man out from the inside, leaving nothing but regret and self-hatred in its place. The men at the table had taken his money, his pride, and now his wife, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The house felt empty without her. The silence stretched on, suffocating and heavy. Daniel sat alone, drowning in the realization that he had destroyed everything. But the worst part was that this wasn't over. Not yet. Daniel spent the next few days in a daze, moving through his house like a ghost. The echoes of his past life surrounded him. Emily's clothes still hung in the closet, her scent lingered in the bedroom, and the absence of her presence made the house feel unbearably hollow. He tried calling her, but she never answered. He sent messages, long, desperate apologies, but there was no response. She had vanished, and he had no one to blame but himself. His so-called friends, the men who had taken everything from him, had moved on without a second thought. They still gathered for their poker nights, laughing, drinking, and gambling without a care in the world. To them, it had been just another game, another night of indulgence. But for Daniel, it had been the breaking point. He no longer saw them as friends. They were something else entirely, monsters who had feasted on his desperation and left him with nothing. The rage inside him grew stronger with each passing day. At first, he tried to drown it with alcohol, numbing the pain with bottle after bottle. But the more he drank, the clearer his thoughts became. This wasn't just about a lost bet anymore. This was about humiliation. This was about revenge. And most of all, this was about Emily. He had lost her, but he wasn't going to let them win. Not like this. Then, one night he saw her, Emily. She wasn't far, just across town in a small apartment complex. But she wasn't alone. One of them was with her, the man who had led the game that night, the one who had taunted him the most. Daniel felt his blood turn cold as he watched them together. It wasn't just anger he felt. It was something far darker, something primal. He followed them for days, watching from the shadows as his rage turned into obsession. He learned their routines, memorized their schedules, and waited for the perfect moment. Every night, as he lay awake in the empty house, he planned his next move. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. They had taken everything from him, and now it was time for them to pay. The first man disappeared without a trace. No one questioned it at first. These were men who lived on the edge, involved in things that often led to trouble. But when the second one went missing, the whispers began. Daniel watched from a distance, silent and unseen, as their confidence began to crack. The fear in their eyes was the only satisfaction he had left. Emily didn't know. She couldn't know. He wasn't doing this to win her back. He was doing this because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. He had lost everything, but at least now he had a purpose. The men who had ruined his life were going to suffer, one by one, and he wasn't going to stop until they were all gone. Daniel had never considered himself a violent man. His life had been built on risks and strategy, not brute force. But something inside him had changed the night he lost everything. He had spent weeks drowning in guilt and self-loathing, but now that darkness had transformed into something else, something with purpose. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. The first kill had been easy. He had followed the man for days, learning his routine, waiting for the perfect moment. A dark alley, a quiet street, a single swift motion, and it was over. There had been no hesitation, no remorse. The man who had once laughed at him, who had taken part in his humiliation, now lay lifeless in the shadows. Daniel had watched the light fade from his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something close to satisfaction. But one wasn't enough. The others were still out there, still living their lives as if nothing had happened. They had to feel what he had felt. They had to suffer. So he continued, moving carefully, methodically, making sure each kill was clean and untraceable. He left no evidence, no pattern, nothing for the police to follow. The men began to realize what was happening. One by one, they disappeared, and the survivors grew paranoid. The remaining members of the group started looking over their shoulders, canceling their usual poker games, avoiding dark streets. They whispered among themselves, trying to figure out who was behind it. But Daniel knew they would never suspect him. To them, he was weak, a broken man, a failure. They had written him off as nothing, and that arrogance was their downfall. As their fear grew, Daniel became bolder. He followed them in broad daylight, watched them from across the street, let them feel his presence. He wanted them to know they were being hunted, just as he had felt hunted the night he lost everything. He wanted them to understand what it was like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of someone else. But there was one problem. Emily, she was still with one of them, the last man on his list. Daniel had planned to take him out just like the others, but something held him back. He needed to know why. Why had she stayed? Why had she chosen to be with the very people who had destroyed their lives? He had told himself this wasn't about winning her back, but deep down, he knew that part of him still wanted answers. So he waited. He watched her, studied her every move, looking for any sign that she regretted what had happened. But the more he watched, the more he realized a painful truth. Emily wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't trapped. She had made her choice, and it wasn't him. That was when he knew what he had to do. The final act of his plan wouldn't just be about revenge. It would be about closure. And this time there would be no survivors. Daniel knew this was the end game. The last man on his list wasn't just another name to cross off. This was the one who had taken Emily, the one she had stayed with. The others had been easy, quick, clean, efficient. But this would be different. This would be personal. He followed them for days, watching their every move. They seemed comfortable together, as if the events of that night had never happened. Emily smiled at him. She laughed. It was the same laugh Daniel used to love hearing, but now it felt like a dagger in his chest. The man, Jason, acted as if he had won, as if Daniel no longer existed. It was as if he had been erased from his own life, replaced by the very person who had taken everything from him. Daniel couldn't let that stand. One night, when Jason was alone, Daniel made his move. He waited in the shadows outside Jason's apartment, watching the lights go out one by one. The city was alive with distant sounds, cars passing, muffled conversations, the occasional siren. But in that moment, it was just the two of them. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times. It had to be perfect. No hesitation, no second guessing. He forced his way inside, catching Jason off guard. There was a struggle, but Daniel had the upper hand. The fear in Jason's eyes was the same fear Daniel had felt the night he lost Emily, the night he had been powerless. Now the roles were reversed. Jason begged, but Daniel didn't listen. He had made his decision the moment he saw them together. When it was over, the silence was deafening. But it wasn't enough. Emily was still out there. She was the last loose end. He had told himself he wasn't doing this for her, but that had been a lie. Deep down, he had wanted her back. He had wanted her to regret leaving, to see what he had become and realize she had made a mistake. But that wasn't going to happen. She had chosen a new life, and in doing so, she had made herself part of the problem. He found her later that night, waiting for Jason to return. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. There was no fear, no anger, just quiet acceptance. She had known this moment was coming. She had seen the news, heard the whispers. She knew what he had been doing. For a brief second, Daniel hesitated. This was Emily, the woman he had loved, the only person who had ever mattered to him. But then he remembered what she had become, what she had allowed to happen. The weight of everything crashed down on him at once. When it was over, Daniel stood alone. The house, the money, the life he had built, it was all gone. And now, so was she. There was nothing left. In the end, the biggest gamble of his life hadn't just cost him his fortune. It had cost him his soul.